Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This is episode number 70 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Welcome, everyone, to the show. My name is Jason Romano. It is great to have you joining us on the program today. As always, you can download and subscribe our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, everywhere podcasts are found. And, of course, you can listen to all of our content on our YouTube page and read all of our content at sportspectrum.com. Today's guest, he is Bill Curry. And if you know football, you know the name Bill Curry. He is a two-time Super Bowl champion, three-time NFL champion, played in the NFL for the Green Bay Packers under the great Vince Lombardi, played with the Baltimore Colts under the great Don Shula. So he played for two Hall of Fame coaches in his NFL career, and then went on to his own coaching career, first as an assistant with the Green Bay Packers, and then the head coach of Georgia Tech, of Alabama, of Kentucky, and then helped start a program at Georgia State later in his career. He's a two-time SEC Coach of the Year. He played in three Super Bowls, three of the first five Super Bowls, actually, Super Bowl I, Super Bowl III, and Super Bowl V. He's a member of the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame, and he's one of the great storytellers in sports right now. And it was my privilege to sit down and talk to him for about 45 minutes. And I can't stress enough how important this podcast is to listen to and just how good Bill Curry is at 75 years old, and the memory that he has of telling stories of his time in sports, and certainly how it intersected with his faith as well. And please take a listen. I would suggest getting a notebook and a pen, because there is more wisdom in this podcast than maybe any previous podcast that we've done. I just teed him up and he went, and it was so good. So sit back and enjoy this podcast, one of my favorites for sure, the amazing wisdom from the incomparable storytelling legend that is Bill Curry. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, Jason. Thank you.
It's great to talk to you, and you and I have kind of known each other through the years and dealings with ESPN, and so it's really neat to kind of have you come on this podcast and tell your story of sports and faith. And you grew up in Georgia, and we'll talk a lot about your career and some of the life lessons you've learned over the years, but let's start right there with your faith in Christ and when that started to take root, to take shape for you.
I had one of those experiences as a child. I lived with a father that was very, very dominating. He was a national light heavyweight Olympic lifting champion. He was a hand-to-hand combat instructor in World War II in the United States Infantry. He was an only child from a very difficult home in his experience. So when he became one of the strongest men in the world, that was a big deal to him. And I was his firstborn child. And I had a wonderful, gentle mom, but Dad and I had a rough time the first few years. And I remember him, at least I think I remember. It may have been that he and I talked about it years later, and then I began to think I remembered at age 6, 7, and 8 in there. And I remember him arguing with his friends about God, and that he didn't need God. God was for weak people, and he wasn't weak, and it was just for sissies. And the tough thing for him to come to grips with was the fact that the people he was talking to were just as tough as he was, but they were devout Christians, and he couldn't quite make sense of that. But by this time, he was coaching at Georgia Military Academy, which is now Woodward Academy, in the outskirts of Atlanta in College Park. And he had national champion boxers that he coached, and weightlifters, and in gymnastics he had great champions. So he was also a very successful coach. But so were his friends, like Coach Doc McKay. And Colonel McKay used to talk to Dad about, well, what about if we take little Bill to Sunday school? Well, he had two boys that were my best buddies, and so Dad said that would be okay. So I started to go to Sunday school at the College Park Presbyterian Church, and I loved it because I had a chance to go with my buddies, and that was fun to me. My dad and the man that we call Uncle Doc, Colonel Doc McKay, who was also a hard-nosed coach, we continued to have those discussions and arguments about the need for God in people's lives. And one time, according to Mom, the legend, wherever I heard this, I know it's true, Dad said, well, what are they teaching my boy up there at that church place? And Colonel McKay said, well, if you had any guts, you'd come find out. Well, Pop went up to the little Presbyterian church, and which just happened to be loaded with godly, saintly, wonderful people. I can tell you their names right now. My Sunday school teachers, these dear, including especially though these folks that were equally as hard-nosed as Dad in a competitive way, but totally committed to Christ. And within 6 months, my dad saw the light, and what I saw was this angry, hostile God, father of mine, transformed from the hostility to a loving, kind. He wasn't perfect, and he never stopped being competitive, ever. But he became a gentle, fun, funny, loving parent who would stay up all night with me if I was sick, and attentive. And it was just such an utter transformation. I have never been tempted to challenge the reality of Christ and what he does in people's lives, including my own. And he has tracked me down many times when I departed from him, and I certainly have done that. I'm ashamed of it, but that's what's happened. But watching my father transform, seeing this godlike creature become God-fearing and God-loving, and bless his heart, he taught Sunday school for about the next 60 years, and he was a great Sunday school teacher. So Christ changes lives, and I had the privilege of seeing that up close and personal, and so it's never been a question in my mind.
When you looked at your dad, and you mentioned how competitiveness and toughness, and your dad looked at it as sort of being weak. As a believer now, and as somebody who's been a Christian for a long time, and certainly competitive, being a coach and being a player on the highest level in the National Football League, talk about how that works as a believer and still being able to be competitive, to be fierce, and what that looks like. Because I think that stigma still kind of carries over even into today's world, when a lot of people look at a person of faith or a person who's quote unquote religious, and they don't think that you can still be tough and competitive and fierce in the way that you perform, especially as an athlete.
Well, I don't think that God cares who wins the games, and I don't think Jesus causes us to make a good tackle. I understand when the kids say things like that they are utterly faithful in what they're saying, but I think when you begin to mature, you begin to realize that what God really wants is this. He gives us each a great gift. Every human being is unique. Every human being has a talent that the rest of humanity does not have. If we did fingerprints all over the world today, if that were possible, there wouldn't be two sets alike in the 7 billion people on Earth. So we're all different, we're each unique, and we each have a gift. If we're going to be on a team, I expect that God expects us to find our gift, develop it, and then give it to the team with all our heart. And if that means blocking and tackling, if you're okay with playing football, and there are some people that are not, and that's fine. Football has a lot of problems. There are a lot of issues that are tough to resolve. But if you give yourself to that squad, then it's my firm conviction that God expects you to give everything you have on every play, legally, fair, square. And that's what the great coaches, and at every turn, when I've tended to turn the wrong way, there's been somebody there, starting with my wife of 55 years. Carolyn has reminded me of my foolishness a million times. And I wouldn't even be here on this earth without that beautiful lady. And so many other coaches have shown up at exactly the right time to point me in the right direction, both as a Christian, but also as a player. You owe it to your teammates to give everything you have all the time. It took me a long time to learn that. But I don't think there's any conflict, and I think it's easily resolved for people who have some maturity in the faith and in the competitive arena.
You talked about coaches that impacted you. Let's talk a little bit about some of the coaches you played under. Your college career at Georgia Tech, you played under the Hall of Famer Bobby Dodd. What was Coach Dodd like, and what was college football like, just playing in your own backyard back in the early to mid-1960s?
Well, Coach Dodd, in his opening lecture every year, he said words to this effect: "Now, men, if you're not a good football player, that's not your fault. That's my fault, because I invited you here. We're not going to run you off." Well, we were in the Southeastern Conference at the time, and there were schools in the SEC that would sign 60 kids every year and run 30 of them off. And it was basically like an NFL training camp. Coach Dodd absolutely refused to do that. Then he would say, "I am a third quarter sophomore at the University of Tennessee, and I'm 53 years old. That is not going to happen to you. Every single one of you is going to graduate because you will attend class. If you want me to run you off from here, cut class. And first I'll run you up and down the stadium steps until you cannot stand up. And then if you insist on cutting class, you will not be at Georgia Tech because you won't survive." And he was deadly serious about that. We had Saturday morning classes, and my buddies in the NFL used to think I was lying about this, but you might have calculus and statistics at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock on Saturday morning and play Alabama at 2 o'clock, and you better be in those classes. It was checked, and he would run you up and down the west stands until you couldn't stand up. I found that out the hard way. So the only reason I graduated from college is because my coach loved me too much to let me self-destruct when I was a lazy student, and I certainly was that. If you stay at Georgia Tech, you don't stay lazy. You learn to sit on the front row and take notes and compete with all those national merit scholars, and you find out you actually can do it. So he did that for virtually all of us. His graduation rate was something like 92% in an era when most schools weren't half that. The other thing that happened was great assistant coaches along the way. I was in my fourth year at Georgia Tech, had not started a single game, and was naturally embarrassed. I had recently married this beautiful Carolyn, and she went to games and watched me stand on the sideline, and that spurred me in a way that other things had not. So I went to one of my coaches and I said, "Coach, why am I not playing? Am I not trying hard enough?" He said, "No, you try very hard. You're just not good enough, and you'll never be good enough. So just go to class, behave yourself, help us recruit, and everything will be okay." He didn't mean any harm by it. But at the same time, another assistant coach by the name of John Robert Bell came to my locker, and he said, "Bill, how about you and me going down to the practice field a little early? There's some things that you could work on, and I'll help you because I know you can play." So when I'm playing in my fourth world championship game 8 years later, who do you think I thought about? Or 6 years later. So John Robert Bell was one of those guys, but there were many assistant coaches on through the NFL that took a personal interest in each of us, not just me, but in each of us. And they were the ones that made big differences in our lives. But John Robert Bell, I probably would have never started a game had he not come and encouraged me at a time of great discouragement. And each one of us has a chance to do that for young people or not so young people in our Christian faith. And it was Coach Bell's faith that spurred him to do that.
It's awesome, the people that we remember even as we get older and who impacted our lives. It literally stays with us forever. We're talking to Bill Curry here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And Bill, you play your college ball at Georgia Tech, and then you're drafted into the NFL, which you weren't supposed to play, as according to one of your coaches. And you're drafted by the Green Bay Packers. In 1965, you come to a team that's established as the best in the NFL, won multiple championships. Let's start with that first meeting with the great coach, Vince Lombardi. And I know your stories are legendary, just hearing you tell them about Coach Lombardi, and I want to get to some of those. But let's start with that first initial meeting. Do you remember that meeting?
I'll never forget it if I live to be 1,000, and that ain't going to happen. But if I live to be, it doesn't matter how long I live. It's lodged firmly in my in the front of my mind because it was so traumatic. I had been the last draft choice. Vince Lombardi had turned to his. The NFL had 20 rounds in the draft in those days. They only have 7 now. And Coach Lombardi had turned to his personnel man and said to Pat Pepler, Pepler, we've drafted 19 players. It's 2 a.m. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. Do something humorous with the 20th selection. So he did. And there I was, a 212-pound offensive center from Georgia Tech. So undersized, last draft choice. But lo and behold, I was invited to play in the college all-star game, which was a wonderful experience. Which meant I reported to training camp 2 weeks late. So we had a flight from Chicago where the game was played, stopped in Milwaukee, and then it went on to Green Bay. And I was to report to training camp by 4 o'clock that afternoon. We get to Milwaukee, and North Central Airlines informs me that my seat, that there's been a mistake, and I'm going to have to get off the plane. So terrified, 22 years old, last draft choice. Last thing in the world I wanted to do is call my wife and tell her I'd been cut before I ever got on the practice field. Because if you were late for a Lombardi meeting, you were finished. And if you weren't an established vet, by the time you were late for a meeting, he just sent you home. And I knew that already. So I asked, shaking like a leaf, I asked for the president of North Central Airlines, and they snickered and said, well, we'll get the manager here. So the manager walks out, and I'm just trying to think as fast as I can on my feet. What in the world could I say to this guy? They've already told me, we'll get you on the next flight, no problem, but it'll be tomorrow morning. I said, no, I've got a report at 4 o'clock, and it's about noon now in Milwaukee. And this guy kind of smirks, and he says, well, I'm sorry, that's the best we can do. I said, well, let me write your name down and your serial number, because I'm getting ready to report to the Green Bay Packers and Vince Lombardi, and I'm going to be late, and it's going to be because of you. The guy's face went white. I have never forgotten that expression. He said, oh, excuse me, Mr. Curry. He walks around from behind the counter. He calls some people aside. They pull my bags off the big plane, put them on a single-engine plane, fly me to Manitowoc, and drive me in a van to West De Pere, Wisconsin, and I walked in at 3:45. That actually happened. That's the power of Vince Lombardi in that state at that time. It was unbelievable.
That's just before you even met him, though. That's the crazy thing, right?
Well, I had met him earlier because they flew Carolyn and me to a Packer game the previous year.
Okay.
After my last game at Georgia Tech, the Packers flew us out, and we sat in the stands in Dallas and watched the Packers destroy the Cowboys, and we sat with Marie Lombardi. It was unbelievable. All of it's like a magic dream. So I had shaken his hand, but that's all. And so that was my first meeting. I walk in, and he's standing there. It's 3:45, and he's standing in the dorm doorway. And he said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'm ready." So that was the first meeting. The second meeting was the next morning. We had the inter-squad game that night, and all I did was snap for a couple of field goals. But the next morning, my door is banged upon at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning, and I thought it was one of the guys messing with me. So I walk over and open it. It's Vince Lombardi. He said, "I don't know your faith, Bill, or if you're going to services." I said, "Well, Bart Starr's invited me to go to church with him at 11. That had actually happened, which was another unbelievable, to be adopted by Bart Starr the day I get there, and that has lasted to this day. But he said, well, if you're going to go at 11, we've got time. Why don't you come sit down with me? And Vince Lombardi sat down with a yellow legal pad and drew up every offensive play in the Packers system. And there weren't very many, nothing like today. They were just sound, and they worked. And I can draw each of those plays. I'm 75 years old. I can draw exactly what he drew for me today because he was such a great teacher. He was a high school physics teacher. That's what Lombardi was.
Wow. Let's talk about him for a minute, because For you, you only played 2 seasons in Green Bay. You were there and you won championships both years in 65 and 66 and played in the first Super Bowl and beat Kansas City and had success. But you only played 2 seasons under Coach Lombardi. And yet today, I think people may associate you more with your time with Coach Lombardi than anything else you've ever done because of the profound impact that he had on you. So let's talk about Coach Lombardi. Give us some stories. Just tell us about what it was like to play under this man.
Well, it was terrifying. And even the veterans, I mean, even the guys that were all pro, that were future Hall of Famers would tell you. He scares me to death when he jumps on me. It feels like I've been slapped. That was Willie Davis's term. And it did feel like that. And at first I was just horrified because his language was different from Coach Dodd. Coach Dodd was the epitome of the Southern gentleman, and Coach Lombardi was not Southern at all. He was from Brooklyn. He was Catholic. He was Italian. He talked like this here, and that wasn't how we talked. And it didn't occur to me till years and years later that I had trouble with him. I was hostile. I was hostile toward him because I couldn't forgive him for not being Bobby Dodd. And that was a very immature response on my part. But I thought he was abusive, and I was wrong. But that's what I thought. I didn't perform very well. Then later, in Super Bowl III, I was the only player in the game that had played for Lombardi and Shula. Don Shula had traded for me and had restored my career. He did for me what John Robert Bell had done years before. He just kept giving me one chance after another, and I owe everything to Don Shula. And I think that was the secret of his greatness. If he ever saw the ingredients in you that he thought would make a football player, he would never give up on you. And he had a bunch of guys that were rejects that became outstanding players for him. And you think about that with those great Dolphin teams, they weren't all superstars. Some of them were, but a lot of them were not. So Shula had done that for me. And so when I was interviewed, I foolishly said, well, I prefer Coach Shula, and Lombardi is abusive, and Coach Shula has a relationship. He's tough, but he's fair, and Coach Lombardi wasn't fair. And it was immoral and stupid on my part. And years later, I found myself going to his hospital room when he was on his deathbed. And again, I was shaking like a leaf. And Marie, God bless her, his wife, who loved Carolyn and me, she treated us like her own. She marched me into that room and sort of nudged me up to the bed, and I took his hand and said, Coach, I came here to apologize because I was wrong and I said some things I shouldn't have. And I came to tell you, you meant a lot to my life. He didn't waver. His body was emaciated, but the eyes were the same. And he gripped my hand and he said, well, you can mean a lot to my life if you'll pray for me. And I promised I would, but wow. I had to leave the room with that. Yeah. He was amazing force of nature. And I wish I would have loved to have played for him later in my career when I was a grown-up.
But you're 27, 28 years old here at this time when you're convicted in some ways, and as believers, we're taught to, daily die to ourselves. We're taught to be repentant, and forgiveness is such a huge aspect of being a believer in Christ. What did that do for you when you're sitting in that hospital room with the coach, the legendary Vince Lombardi, in a state that you probably hadn't imagined ever seeing him in, and yet you're the one who's choosing, to ask for this forgiveness, and he's accepting it. He's forgiving you. What did that do to you?
Well, what did the great man do? The great man, and again, I emphasize, just like I said about my father, he wasn't perfect. He was rough, but all of us are rough. Nobody plays in the NFL that's just a nice guy. And the kind of success he had, you have to push and you have to demand. But he was a godly man. He was a great man. And what did he do? to the terrified kid, in the moment when I least deserved it, he forgave me. And that's what's expected of each of us. And I pray that when I face my moment of truth like that, that I can be half the Christian that he was.
I want to talk about Coach Lombardi's faith for a minute. And obviously you've alluded to it on some level and how it's impacted you. But what was it like to be around this guy? Because it's in the late 60s. It's a different time than today. And I know back then, sort of faith wasn't frowned upon, or wasn't as worldly rejected in some ways. And it's like keep that private, keep that private. But in the late 60s, people were, always talk about Coach Lombardi as saying it was about your religion, your family, and then the Packers. And that was sort of this motto that even I remember, Jimmy V telling the story before he passed at the ESPYs about Vince Lombardi and him trying to be like Coach Lombardi. But for you, seeing this guy who is so hard-nosed and disciplined, and you're terrified to be around this guy, and yet there's a faith aspect to this man. Were you ever able to kind of pull back the curtain on that side of it with Coach Lombardi and see that aspect of his life?
Not till I went in that hospital room. I went to Bart Starr. Again, Bart sort of took me in, and I'm eternally grateful to him and to Cherry, his wife, because they adopted Carolyn and me as if we were their own. And so I went to Bart, and of course, the most judgmental human beings I know on earth are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, males. We preach non-judgment, and then we're the most judgmental bunch of guys you've ever seen on the face of the earth. So naturally, I went to Bart and I said, "Hey, Bart, there ain't no way this guy's a Christian. You're a legend, your family in the Green Bay Packers." Well, he gets confused about the order of the priorities every day on the practice field. And Bart laughed and he said, "Look, Bill, this guy is so devout. He goes to Mass every morning. He's a Catholic." Well, I didn't know any Catholics.
Right.
Yeah, I had one buddy that was a Catholic, and he was around her, so that's all I knew. So naturally, I was being judgmental, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, especially Southern males are. I'm ashamed of that, but we are. Yeah. So I said to Bart, I said, "There ain't no way this guy goes to church every day. You can't convince me." He said, "Well, Bill, I'm telling you, he does. But after you've been working for this man about 3 weeks, you're going to realize this man needs to go to church every day." So, we chuckled, but then I got to thinking, well, maybe we all need to go to church every day. Yeah. If Coach needed to go to church every day, then it wouldn't be a bad thing for the rest of us to, in our own way. And we really should from the devotional sense. But he was deadly serious about everything he did. If he was teaching physics at St. Cecilia High School, I guarantee you he was the greatest physics teacher alive. And when he came to the NFL to coach football, it was all Packer football all day, every day. And then when it was time to go to services, he would let us go to services, and that was it. Family stuff mattered as well. He would have a big Thanksgiving lunch for all the kids and the wives, and he was great with the kids. And I always wondered about that, but it was just he was sincere. But on the practice field, and the upshot of it was, as a football player, you had no choice but to concentrate on the matter at hand every instant of every day that you were with this guy.
And then you play for Don Shula, and you talked about Coach Shula with your time in the Colts, and then you go on to be a head coach, and you go on to start with as an assistant in the NFL, and then you become a head coach at Georgia Tech, and eventually Alabama, and Kentucky, and Georgia State. So you become a coach after playing for some of the most legendary coaches there are. So talk about coaching, what you learned, how you might have instilled all of the different things that you took from, Coach Dodd and Coach Lombardi and Coach Shula, and kind of brought that into the way that you went about coaching young men, especially in college.
I think the first thing you learn as a head coach is that you can't be Bobby Dodd or Vince Lombardi. And my beautiful Carolyn, my first year as a head coach, I walk in after yet another disappointing loss, and she said, "I want you to sit down over here. I want to tell you something that I observed." I said, "Okay." She said, "You're trying to look like Bobby Dodd." You're trying to walk like him. You're trying to talk like him. You're trying to act like Coach Dodd on the sideline. Well, I exploded. I was furious at her. So what does that mean? When your wife tells you something and you flip out, what does that mean? You tell me. That means she's right.
Absolutely.
She's dead right. So I realized that's exactly what I was doing, but it was utterly unconscious. So I'm trying to, I don't know how I would describe Coach Dodd. He wore a Brooks Brothers suit and a brown fedora. I had on a coaching outfit, my coaching shirt. I didn't try to go the suit route, but I was standing like him, and I was pointing to the field like him, and I didn't have any idea I was doing it. So the first lesson you learn is that you have to be yourself. You can't be Don Shula or Vince Lombardi or Bobby Dodd. There was only one of those, and there's only one of you. And whatever God gave me, I have to use that to try to reach inside the hearts of young people to help them to be the best they can be, the best human being, the best person of faith, the best student, the best future husband, the best teammate, and then the best guard or center or quarterback or wide receiver or DB or whatever it is that each child is. And I think that's the challenge for every coach. And the ones who are the most authentic, I think, are the ones that can reach today's young people.
We'll talk about winning and losing a little bit, Coach. I'll call you Coach, Bill. You also played, you played 2 Super Bowls with the Colts. We talked about that. You lost one. That was the legendary Super Bowl III to Joe Namath and the Colts. And then you won one over Tom Landry's Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl V. So I want to just ask you a little bit about winning and losing. You've certainly won a lot of games as a coach as well. So what do you think you learn more from in your life as in sports? Do you learn more from winning and what it takes to get to that aspect of getting the victory, or do you learn more in losing?
Well, unfortunately, I learned more from losing because we lost more than we won. We had some startup situations, but that's no excuse. And we had some situations in which we should have won more. But you learn more from the losses than you do if everything is going your way. I mean, I did play in those 2 Super Bowls you mentioned, but I also played in a world title game my rookie year, in which we beat Cleveland for the NFL title, and I played in Super Bowl I. So I played in Super Bowls I, III, and V, and I began to think, this is how it's going to be the rest of my life. Gee, we're just going to win all the time.
Right.
But guess what? That was 1970. That's the last time I played in a world championship game or coached in one. I never coached in one. I coached in a national championship game, and we lost when I was at Alabama. And that was my fault. So the second thing you learn when you become the head coach is that everything is your responsibility. You learn that real leadership never points fingers, never blames somebody else. If you lose the game, if your guys are not performing well, it's the head coach's responsibility. And if the head coach doesn't take that responsibility, then the team never makes the progress that it should. So people who call themselves leaders, who blame other people for their responsibilities, are the worst examples. And the best are people who take total responsibility and get it corrected. One of the great games I've seen in a long time was that Rose Bowl, and it was from our rivals, the Georgia Bulldogs. And at the half, they were being run out of the stadium by Baker Mayfield and the rest of his awesome weapons on that Oklahoma team. Yeah. And Kirby Smart stood right there and said, this is coaching. This is my fault. We're playing terrible, and we're going to fix it. That's what you do to be a leader. And your guys are watching, and they're listening, and they learn from those instances. That's what the great coaches do.
You're one of the great storytellers, in my opinion, and I love that. And you've been telling some amazing stories, and I'm so grateful and appreciative to you for coming on this podcast. But I wonder if you could just tell us a story about adversity, where adversity came your way and your faith in Christ helped you get through it. It could be something that happened on the field as a coach, being part of athletics, or it could be something in your own life that's away from the field. But just tell us a story and share where adversity came your way and how important faith in Christ was to help you through it.
Wow, there's so many. And Christ has dragged me out of the cesspool so many times.
Yeah.
We had a great prospect of a player at Alabama. And everybody's going to know who it is, so I might as well say his name. His name was Joe King. Joe had a very serious addiction problem. He was 6'7", 315 pounds, 11% body fat. Looked like a model off of GQ. He was very attractive, very good player. But I had to send him home from a bowl game. We had to put him into treatment, and he ended up being shot in the back, making a drug deal. And it was 4 a.m. I get a call. So I jump in my car and I fly to UAB Medical Center in Birmingham. And I walk in this darkened room, and there is Joe's mom sobbing, and his father, and his best friend, and his wife, and his minister. And we're all just standing there praying for Joe. They roll him out of surgery. And without opening his eyes, as they roll him into that darkened, very depressed room, he raises that big paw of his with blood all over it, and he says, "Is my coach here?"
Wow.
My life was changed. I had some bad habits that I'm not proud of. Well, they changed. They changed immediately.
Yeah.
And sad part of the story is we lost Joe a couple of spring before last, but he called me to come to his hospital near the end of his life when it was clear he wasn't going to live because of a car accident. He had become a quadriplegic. He said, "I want to apologize to you, Coach. I went into prison. Each time I went into prison, I preached the gospel and I brought people to Jesus, and then I would get out of prison and I would just flip out and get drunk again, and I let you down, and I deceived you, and I lied to you, and I want you to know that that I'm sorry. I want you to forgive me." I said, "Joe, I never told you that you changed my life by the way you responded to your worst adversity. And so I want to thank you." And we both thank God that we were brought together, even in these circumstances. And at the time, we prayed that he would live. He did not. But it was an unbelievable experience of how God works with two imperfect souls, two big lugs who love him and loved each other. And as tough as it turned out, at least we were bonded by faith as we went through that thing.
Yeah, and that's not something that they teach you in the manual of coaching, right? I mean, that's not something that you can prepare for.
There's not a place in the manual, no.
What a great story. Well, just a couple more questions here with Bill Curry on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And Bill, I remembered it was the final show of Mike and Mike, a show I worked on for a few years, and a show that you've been a guest on many times before they ended in mid-November of 2017. And there was something that you said, specifically a couple-minute video that kind of went around social media and kind of blew up and went viral, specifically talking about the importance of football and the huddle. And I remember listening back as I prepared for this podcast and just listening to the question from Greeny and Golick, and it was simply, are there any last words? I don't even think they asked you a specific question about football and the huddle. It was just kind of what was on your heart and where you went. And I'm wondering, for those that haven't heard it, if you could kind of share with our audience kind of your thoughts and what you said that day about the importance of football and the huddle and how it kind of translates into our lives.
Sure. It is important. Most of us know where we were on September 11th, 2001. When I say that date, circumstances pop into our minds. But most of us do not know where we were on September 13th, 2001, Thursday of that week of the fateful fall of the Twin Towers and the death of so many wonderful American citizens. I know where I was because ESPN had ensured that we would not get on airplanes that week because of the obvious. They had given us assignments to which we could drive from our residences. So I was driving from our home in North Carolina to Birmingham to be the analyst, which is what I did every week. I was a football analyst for college football. But it was to be the Southern Mississippi versus University of Alabama game, if indeed it were to be played. The NCAA and the conferences were meeting to determine whether or not to try to play the games. Do we really want to put pods of 75,000 Americans all over the country, not knowing what we're dealing with here? Are we in a shooting war that's going to extend? We just don't know. So I pull into a filling station in Attalla, Alabama, on the way to Birmingham. And a nice guy, a filling station attendant there, recognized me. He said, "Hey, Coach, we're going to play these games this week?" Because everybody was wondering. And I said, "Well, I don't know. But if this cell phone rings that I got in my pocket here, if it rings while I'm in your station, you may be the first fan in America to find out whether or not we're playing." Sure enough, I got a call a couple of minutes later from ESPN saying, "Go home. We're not playing." A good decision, I thought. So I walked back up to this nice guy, and he's standing behind the counter, and I said, "Well, I got the call, and we're not playing." Well, I will never forget his response. His face turned red, his jugular popped out, and he leaned forward to me with utter intensity. He said, "Well, let me tell you something, Coach. In Attalla, Alabama, come Friday night, we're going to play football because it means a lot to us." I said, wow. I couldn't get him out of my mind or my heart. Why does it mean a lot in Attalla, Alabama to play high school football? Or why does it mean a lot in College Park, Georgia, or Pueblo, Colorado, or in New Hampshire, or California, or New Mexico, or all over these 50 states? Why does it mean a lot to our communities? I was so distraught and I was so shaken that I decided to turn it into a spiritual exercise. I had learned in theology school just to ask God to just get quiet, shut your mind off and shut your mouth and let God speak to you. And it started to come to me. The huddle on Friday night in the United States of America, that's where diversity happens. Because you can't step into a huddle anymore and say, "I'm not playing with that guy because his skin is darker than mine." You can't say, "I don't like that guy's religion." You can't say, "Build a wall against this guy's people," because he's your teammate and you love him. And what happens in the stands when somebody's son scores a touchdown? Everybody hugs. They don't stop to see what color the skin is or whether they have the right religion. They just hug. And the community comes together and sees that huddle, resonates with it, and takes the huddle and us players into their hearts. That's what football can be in its best manifestation. That's what we have to hope for.
I just love listening to that. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. We have one more question to ask. And again, I appreciate your time here, Bill. And it's a question we ask all of our guests here on the podcast. And it's a simple question, sometimes not always a simple answer, but it's quite simply, as you're walking in your faith with the Lord, and it's been a long time now that you've been a Christian. You said you're 75 years old and been through so much. But in this time where you are now, what are you learning from the Lord? What has God been teaching you?
Patience. Patience. How can this be happening in our country? I'm so horrified by the lack of quality of sheer courtesy and kindness that we see from people who are posing as leaders, that I become judgmental. And the next thing I know, I'm calling them the same names that they call people. And my son, God bless him, he said, "Dad, you got a lot of anger. You got a lot of anger. Have you prayed over this?" So instead of moaning and calling our leaders bad names, I started praying for them. I realized that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to ask God's intervention and to give them perspective and wisdom and, yes, courtesy and some of the things that I wish I would see in them, and stop being so judgmental and make sure that I am praying the right prayer for the people that are going to decide what this nation becomes. And so it has been an incredible learning time for me, and God teaches me. He slaps me down every time I get competitive and angry and start using those NFL locker room words. He doesn't like that, and he makes me feel so bad when I do it that I would like to hope by the time I'm 100, maybe I'll stop completely. But he's working on me hard, and I'm a work in progress, and he makes me remember that every day, and I'm so eternally grateful.
He is Bill Curry. He's a 2-time Super Bowl champion, 3-time NFL champion because he played that first year before the Super Bowl started, and he's also one of the most revered, I think, figures in sports right now. Just a great storyteller, and it's been a treat to listen to you, Bill Curry, and I'm grateful for your time, and I thank you so much for being a guest here on the podcast, and God bless you, and look forward to, many, many, many more years of storytellings from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, and we're all excited about your work, and you've been a tremendous gift, really, a motivation for the rest of us. So God bless you. Keep up the good work.
Wow. How good was that? We do thank Bill Curry, 3-time NFL champion, 2-time SEC Coach of the Year, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast and sharing his amazing stories. I mean, Coach Vince Lombardi, I mean, just that alone is worth the price of admission, but also playing under Coach Don Shula and what he learned with him. Just the storytelling, the memory that this guy has is amazing to me. I hope I have half the memory at 75 years old that Bill Curry has right now, and I just hope that he lives on forever because he truly is a treasure, and I hope that he's telling these stories well into his 90s because he is just a true sports legend. And we do thank Bill Curry for being here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And we do thank you for listening. As always, you can reach us on Twitter at sports_spectrum. And we're over on Facebook and on Instagram as well. And certainly all of our podcasts are on our YouTube page. So subscribe there and listen to them on that page as well. You can reach me on Twitter at Jason Romano, and you can email me, jason@sportsspectrum.com. If you have any guest ideas or any thoughts about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. We also encourage you to leave a review on iTunes. Just go to the Apple iTunes podcast, find Sports Spectrum, and click on leave a review, and hopefully you enjoy this podcast. And if you did enjoy this podcast, I would simply ask that you share it. Share it to your Facebook page, your Twitter page, even your Instagram page, and let people know about this podcast, about these stories, Bill Curry specifically, his stories on the intersection of sports and of faith. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and we will see you next time right here at Sports Spectrum.